In June 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, was rocked by a gruesome crime. The Moore family parents, Josiah and Sarah, their 4 children, and 2 young girls who were spending the night, were all bludgeoned to death with an axe. The crime scene was horrific. All 8 victims had severe head wounds, and the walls and ceilings were splattered with blood. The killer had used the blunt end of the axe to smash in the victims' faces, leaving them unrecognizable. The town was in shock. No one could imagine who would have committed such a heinous crime. The police launched an intense investigation, but they had little to work with. There were no signs of forced entry, and no fingerprints were found at the scene. In 1912, Iowa was mostly an agricultural state with a population of around 2.3 million people. On a sunny Sunday morning, various residents of Villisca, Iowa, begin their day. Henry Enerson calls Reverend Ewing to ask if visiting minister, Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly, can stay with them that evening. Reverend Ewing agrees to host Kelly. At 11 a.m., the Moore family attends the Presbyterian Church for morning worship and sermon. Sarah Moore's friend, Mrs. Myers, attends the Methodist Church. Bruce Stillians opens his father's drugstore for business, while Lee Van Gilder sees one of the Stillians boys talking to Joe Moore. Father, Joe Moore, was a prominent businessman who owned an implement store. His wife, Sarah, was a housewife who was actively involved in the Presbyterian Church. In the afternoon, Reverend Kelly preaches at a schoolhouse in District 10 in nearby Arlington, and Mrs. Ewing, Sarah Moore, and Miss Hughes work with the children on a special service to be presented at the Presbyterian Church. Lena and Ina Stillinger are there rehearsing along with Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul Moore. 1 mile east of Villisca, Mr. Talbot saw a man come out of the timber and head towards Villisca. He and his wife were on their way to church when they passed the man on the road. The first bell rang for the young people's services at the Presbyterian Church. At 6:52 p.m., Joe Moore's brother, Fenric Moore, arrived at the Villisca Depot on the number 2 and went to visit his parents. Reverend Ewing and Reverend Kelly headed to the church for the Young People's Meeting service. The evening settled as darkness fell. Mary Peckham retired to her bedroom, located upstairs in the southern part of the house. Meanwhile, her son Ernest occupied the eastern room, his sleep patterns unknown to the rest of the household. As the clock approached 9 p.m., the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church came to an end. Reverend Ewing took note that the Stillinger girls, who lived about 3 miles away in the countryside, would often walk to church on Sunday mornings. With the program concluded, preparations for flower bouquets intended for the sick were underway, causing the Moore family to linger at the church. In the darkness outside the park, an unidentifiable man passed by Horton and night watchman Overman. The man was described as small size with heavy shoulders, donning a bell-topped cap. Hank Horton attempted to engage the stranger in conversation, urging Overman to shed some light on the mysterious figure. However, Overman dismissed the need for illumination, and Horton expressed his habit of making strangers speak to him. Eventually, the Moore family and Reverend Kelly, who had been waiting for the Ewings to finish their tasks, were the last to leave the church. The Ewings, accompanied by their 2 children, headed home, lighting their way through the darkness. Once at the house, the adults engaged in conversation about the evening's events, Kelly's ministry, and English customs. It was now 10 p.m., and Reverend Ewing and his wife prepared for bed. They held a devotional prayer before settling in for the night, accompanied by their sick daughter. Reverend Kelly was shown to his room with a balcony, and the Ewings provided him with an alarm clock set for 4:30 a.m. Outside, the Ewing children were already sleeping in a tent. However, the night proved restless for the Ewings, as their little girl's illness kept them awake. Around midnight, Reverend Kelly found himself standing on the balcony outside his room, straining to identify a sound he believed resembled the thud of an axe. Meanwhile, Mike Overman, after completing his rounds, made his way to Miller's restaurant by the depot. There he encountered 2 young men who had no place to sleep for the night. Following this, Overman settled himself on a corner in the park, keeping a watchful eye on the surroundings until 2 a.m. Tragically, sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. on June 10, 1912, a horrifying event unfolded. 8 members of the Josiah B. Moore family, along with the 2 visiting Stillinger girls, were ruthlessly murdered with an axe while they slept, casting a dark shadow over the peaceful town of Villisca. Reverend George Kelly was a prime suspect in the gruesome Villisca Axe Murder that occurred in 1912. His suspicions arose because of his erratic behavior and an alleged confession made to a couple of people. However, there was no solid evidence to support the accusations against him. Despite this, Reverend Kelly was put on trial and later acquitted. But the stigma of being a prime suspect in such a heinous crime never went away. He was forced to move from place to place and was ostracized by society. The Reverend's life was consumed by the allegations, and he descended into madness. He was eventually committed to an asylum where he spent the remainder of his days. The Villisca Axe Murder remains unsolved to this day. The victims' families never got the closure they deserved, and the prime suspect who lived out his days in an asylum is a constant reminder of the tragedy that took place all those years ago. The community is left wondering if justice was ever truly served, or if the true killer is still out there, walking among them.